As we near the tail end of version 2, there's a lot that's being discussed throughout Honkai Star Rail's discourse. Questions like which combat engine turned out the best, what new gimmicks or playstyles will be introduced in version 3, and the current state of the meta, among other things. The game now has a substantial number of units with an equally substantial number of ways to form a strong party. Much of version 2 was spent expanding on the various engines we have now. Prevailing Wisdom is fully aware of the present dominance of break damage and follow-up attacks. Spearheaded by Harmony MC and Facial respectively, their cadres occupy almost the entirety of the Apex tiers in every category possible, from damage dealers to specialists to supports and to sustain. Much attention's been given to them, whereas on the other hand, damage over time has been given the short end of the stick, marking the first time they've been decisively excluded from the Apex tiers in 2 out of the 3 game modes, with there being no evidence to suggest they'll get any support for the remainder of version 2. Not just that, but assuming this video comes out when I expect it to, a couple weeks ago there was a fair bit of controversy towards Akron and Sparkle being knocked down a peg as well, which as you may recall are 2 prominent members of the Hyper Carry archetype. For today's discussion, I want to go over just that, talk about why Hyper Carries are not doing so hot, and what can be done to help them out in ways that don't just accidentally buff the dominant engines even more. Unlike damage over time, break, and follow-ups, which are clearly defined by the mechanics from which they derive their name, the Hyper Carry engine isn't a formal class in Star Rail, rather a term coined by the community to represent units who deal damage in ways other than the aforementioned 3. However, if you wish to be pedantic about it, you could technically assign the Hyper Carry status to units like Facial and Firefly if you so choose. To distinguish the two, let's establish a couple ground rules. Every team features a character who will expectedly deal the bulk of its DPS, even if the rest of the team can also contribute. In any Facial team, it's no surprise that Foxy in general practically 1v9s a game. Likewise, in a Firefly or a Boonhill team, of course they'll be the ones blowing everything up. Unless you want to split hairs and say it's Harmony MC. While that does mean they're the carry of the team, what separates them from Hyper Carries is what the rest of the team is trying to accomplish. Follow-up attack teams are characterized by everyone working in tandem with each other to collectively boost the entire team's output. Take Facial, Aventurine, Robin, and Topaz, affectionately, if not cringely referred to as Fart. Facial gains points towards her ultimate whenever she or her allies attack. In addition, she gets to launch a follow-up attack after every teammate's attack. This follow-up attack then accelerates both Numby's action and racks up stacks towards Aventurine's follow-up, who in turn reciprocate by accelerating stacks on Facial's ultimate, all of which give Robin more energy to then give her team more chances to attack. It's a mutual gain for everyone. You can therefore make the conclusion that while Facial does end up being the carry of the team, it's more of a group effort. By contrast, a Hyper Carry's team elects to pool all available resources towards augmenting the Hyper Carry in question's damage as far as they can. The 3 supporting units are there solely for the purpose of maximizing the DPS's uptime, power, and consistency. This could range from boosting offensive parameters like crit stats, to increasing the number of turns they can take per cycle, to shielding them from enemy attempts to disrupt their rotation, etc. At the expense of their pressure, the hope is for the carry to deal damage equivalent to 2 or 3 or 4 attacking units, and for a time they were able to do so rather competently. Seele was the first feature 5-star in Honkai Star Rail and also the first Hyper Carry. She had a clear premise: resets. By executing a target, she would gain a substantial boost in damage for her next turn, which would also be accelerated to immediately take place, allowing her to effectively strike twice per turn. Usage of turn refreshes from supports like Bronya and Sparkle were especially effective due to its value being doubled on a character like her. Couple that with Seele's ultimate, and she could very easily take 6 turns in one action, making her the poster child of a Hyper Carry. The goal of playing her is to get her as close to one-shotting anything as you possibly could to make use of Resurgence each and every turn. Later down the road, we were given Lunai Danheng and Jingliu. Danheng's whole shtick is giving himself a bottomless supply of skill points to get his triple empowered basic attack off every turn if possible, while Jingliu's is all about maximizing her damage to make the most use out of her finite number of empowered skill uses. You'll notice there's no reciprocity between the carry and the supports. All signs point to the carry, whereas in dot, break, and follow-ups it's less about the carry and more about the team as a whole. Not unlike how in reaction-based teams in Genshin, it's more about driving a collective goal instead of facilitating one person's agenda. Part of what enabled Hyper Carries to dominate the meta in version 1 and early version 2 was that members of the archetype are fully self-contained. Jingliu, Seele, and Lunai Danheng have everything they need within their base kits. Even though they do have aspects that can be enhanced and interacted with, their own mechanics are accessed by themselves and only themselves. For instance, Seele's Resurgence mechanic is dependent on her dealing the finishing blow against an enemy, while Bronya's skill allows her to do this again. Those two objectives correlate with each other, not cause one to lead into another. There's indirect synergy. Conversely, someone like Kafka, whose skill and ultimate copy-paste all dot effects, gets directly enhanced by other units applying dot effects. It's a feedback loop, aka direct synergy. Early on in version 2, we were graced by Akron, the current running stateswoman of the Hyper Carry niche. Unlike those who came before her, she actually has the mechanic that directly hinges on her party members, which in hindsight might be the reason she held on for so long while all others have fallen off. In addition to having ludicrously high numbers, with access to her ultimate being tied to the frequency in which debuffs were applied to enemies as opposed to energy, she was able to stand the test of time much better thanks to having an element of direct synergy. Therein lies the first of two major causes behind the decline of hypercarries. Most of them lack any semblance of direct synergy with others due to their self-contained nature. Having direct synergy makes it so a character can get stronger through either receiving buffs to their kit or from buffs to the engine with which they synergize. Considering gacha games rarely if ever have balance patches, you have to rule out the first possibility. This means the only way a character gets stronger or weaker is by the second possibility, changes to the engine. But because of hypercarries not possessing any direct synergy, they have essentially no way of getting buffed, or at least no way of doing so in a manner that benefits them proportionally greater than their competition. Look at Topaz for example. From practically mid-tier to now one of the most essential components for the follow-up engine, she might be one of the most indirectly buffed characters throughout the entirety of Starro. In comparison to Jingyuan, whose Lightning Lord doesn't have any way to mingle with other party members, Topaz's Nabi is a lot more sociable, advancing his action forward by half a turn whenever Topaz and or her teammates deals a follow-up attack. When she first came out, she had no one else to play with, but then in 1.6, she received a dedicated follow-up attacker to support in the form of Ratio. Then later she received Aventurine, a dedicated follow-up tank to benefit from, and then she received Robin, who while not having follow-up attacks herself, supports the follow-up engine incredibly efficiently. From then on, Topaz continued to get stronger and stronger as more follow-ups came about, Yunli, Feishal, Lingsha, etc. Topaz's kit has not changed at all, but she got stronger and stronger anyway courtesy of the follow-up engine getting stronger and her having direct synergy with it. That's how she was able to mature in value while Jingyuan has been struggling. Jingyuan is a follow-up attacker who is designed like a hypercarry, barring him from partaking in the same benefits. In light of their selfish nature, hypercarries are built on the basis of working regardless who is on their team, making it next to impossible to give them a meaningful buff without it coming off as explosive pandering. Jingliu's talent functions on a personal mechanic known as Syzygy. The only way to acquire more stacks is by using her base skill or ultimate, not counting her technique being used to start a fight. No other character can give her more stacks directly. The only way they can do so is by giving her more turns to stack up or giving her more energy to use her ultimate, but that's a one-to-one benefit. On the other hand, someone supporting Akron, for example, could get more than a 1-to-1 ratio. Debuffing a target not only grants your party more DPS, but it also works towards Akron's ultimate stacking as an additional perk. With the right team, you can consistently pull off her ultimate once every other turn cycle, or potentially once every cycle, letting you tap into upwards of 1,000,000 damage at a time. Curiously though, with the release of 2.6, Akron's no longer at tier 0 in any game mode. Considering how meta-relevant she is, in that even if the MOC, PF, or APOC cycle has nothing supporting ultimate damage or lightning attacks, she can still brute force her way through everything, people are noticeably concerned at the drop in placement. Whether it's merited is subjective. I for one low-key agree that base Akron without her weapon might struggle to keep up against base Feishal, but when E0S1 or E2S1 is brought up, then we can debate that another time. In any case, in spite of her modicum of direct synergy, it doesn't change the fact that Akron is first and foremost a hypercarry and suffers just like her peers, even if it's at a lesser degree. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that self-contained kits for DPS characters often works to their disadvantage in a game like Starro, where team building has everything to do with the team itself, not just one person. While everyone typically has their own personal mechanic, depending on how that influences their kit, it can either give them tons of room for synergy or no room for synergy, and you can see that with a unit like Blade. Blade's unique interactions with health once used to be a source of potential, but now they're what's holding him back. Since the majority of other units don't have any interactions or loss of health, Blade fell off the hardest among himself, Danheng, and Jingliu. Jade's very specific side effect of draining HP was about the only thing he ever got. In fairness, it's not right to completely disregard one-to-one benefits. A buff is still a buff after all. But opportunity cost is a driving force in almost any game with the meta. Whatever is most optimal or efficient will be naturally and understandably chosen. A character could be objectively good but be considered mid-tier purely because there's someone better than them at that job. Hypercarries not only have trouble receiving new benefits from their team, but they also suffer from offering little, if anything else, in return. Calling back to the feedback loop we see in the other three engines, the inclusion of a character not only works towards making the carry stronger, but the included character stronger as well. Damage over time, break, and follow-up all have the potential to reach a gestalt, an outcome greater than the sum of its individual parts. Most hypercarries do not. Take the break engine for example. By implementing a character like Ron Mei with Harmony Trailblazer, she gives them more break efficiency to break enemies faster, and they in turn give her more break damage through Super Break, simultaneously boosting both characters in the process. Whereas if Ron Mei were to support, say, Jingliu, she would give Jingliu more damage, but Jingliu would give nothing to her in return. So while on paper Ron Mei is a great support for Jingliu, she's an even better support in other teams. Even Akron, who is an element of direct synergy, offers nothing in return to her party members. Chelcho buffing Akron's ultimate damage and applying debuffs is certainly a great asset to her, but Akron doesn't have anything that makes Chelcho's job easier. It's a one-way street. Taking that into consideration, hypercarries are placed in an overwhelming disadvantage. First, they have to contend with the fact that their kits demand specific things to make themselves stronger, i.e. Dan Heng explicitly needing skill points to do his job, Blade depending on HP manipulation for his win condition, or Acheron necessitating debuffs. Second, they have to contend with the fact that they're the only one dealing any measurable amount of damage on their team compared to follow-ups, breaks, and damage over time where it's 2, 3, or sometimes all 4 members doing good damage. And last but most certainly not least, they also have to contend with the fact that while buffs to them are additive, buffs to those teams are multiplicative. Combining the second and third problems together, the Hyper Carry doesn't have to deal damage equal to that of 3 or 4 party members to stay relevant. They have to deal damage equal to 5, 6, or sometimes 7 to also account for the reciprocal buffs those parties give to each other. They have to work so much harder just to keep up with dot, follow-up, and break teams. In a way, Acheron's power creep numbers were not a privilege but a crutch to help her survive against the sheer DPS scaling of follow-up and break teams in particular. They had to set her so far ahead of everyone else at the time she was released because even back then, conceptually speaking, the potential for follow-ups and breaks to explode was extremely noticeable, even damage over time if they got actual support. When they brought Fei Xiao, who was given the same what the f numbers and whatnot in her kit, she would have been on par with Acheron if it were just point for point, but she also has the advantage of being part of an engine that can amplify her strength several fold. It was not a matter of if Jingliu, Blade, Seele, and Lunai Dan Heng would fall off, but when. They, and by extension their supports, were made only marginally stronger than their competition at the time they came out. Acheron was made effectively twice as strong as Jingliu, and she's feeling the pressure of getting outscaled. To be clear, I'm not saying Hyper Carry's dead and all the units are washed, I'm just explaining why they were slowly losing ground over the past year. For all intents and purposes, they're still good, they're not Yanqing. But seeing as how most of these units were once the best of the best, it's definitely profound. Fixing this can be rather difficult too. They have little if any direct synergy, which makes designing support units just to buff them and no one else close to unfeasible. The most logical choice would be to make a unit who can battery ultimates, seeing as how ultimates are pretty important for hyper carries. The problem is that reliance on ultimates are not exclusive to just carries. Topaz, Rappa, and Dr. Ratio benefit just as much from getting more ultimates as Seele and Jingliu. I mean, granted, most follow-up and break units don't particularly need a battery for their ultimates, as they either have easy access to them like Firefly or don't need one like Fei Xiao, but there's close to nothing that helps out hyper carries more than the other three. Even turn advancing, which has been seen as the traditional way to make hyper carries better, can be just as beneficial for break, follow-up, and dot teams. Probably the only way to make hyper carry supports is through massively amplifying a single character, like Tingyun, seeing as the other teams are more than just one person. But right now, single target supports are given the same numbers as supports who buff the entire team. The single target supports need to have more. It's unlikely that hyper carries of old will ever make it back to the Apex tiers unless Hoyo makes it obvious they're trying to do so, therefore they just have to figure it out for units going forward. They should definitely aim to give future hyper carries a stronger baseline than attackers of other engines, like how they did with Acheron, along with implementing some semblance of direct synergy so as to allow them to have some measure of meta resilience. Alternatively, if they're open to keeping the roster from power creeping too much and breathing new life into hyper carries, they could stand to release more specialized support. Blade is still waiting for HP supports. It would be interesting if Seele could have a party consisting of herself and 3 turn advancers to get like 12 actions in one turn. Or a supporter specifically gives more stacks of a character's respective stacks, so that Jingliu can get more synergy and Dan Heng can get more Squama Sacrosancta. And obviously Acheron still has room to get stronger if more debuffs come about. There was a funny thing they did with equipment with the Lushaka set, so bringing hyper carries back is not entirely out of the question, it's just really challenging based on their design approach. For all we know though, they might just phase hyper carries out altogether and make everything a team effort, but which do you prefer? Do you think hyper carries need to stay in the game, or do you personally not care if they stop releasing them? Let me know in the comments down below. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you love to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsFarum, join my Discord server, and check out my other archetype discussions if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.